Narrator, slow, deliberate tone. On a cold January morning in 1904, in the quiet seaport town of Portsmouth, a single photograph was taken. The ground was pale with frost, the air sharp enough to sting the skin. The townspeople, solemn and bundled in thick black coats, gathered in a small churchyard to mourn the death of a woman many of them barely knew. The photographer, Samuel Pierce, a local professional with a reputation for meticulous compositions, set up his large wooden camera at the edge of the grave. He prepared a fragile glass plate, adjusted the focus, and instructed the mourners to stay very still. In that era, photographs were not snapped in a second, they were composed like portraits, every figure captured deliberately. Pierce, standing beneath a dark cloth to peer through his lens, noted something peculiar even then, an almost unnatural stillness among the crowd. Of course, funerals were quiet by nature, but this silence felt heavier. The only sounds were the crunch of frozen earth beneath boots and the slow creak of the coffin's rope as it was lowered into the ground. The woman in the coffin was Clara Whitfield, 31 years old, unmarried, educated, and, by the standards of the time, unusually wealthy. Her sudden death had stunned those who knew her, though few suspected anything beyond tragedy. The doctor had signed the papers without hesitation. Heart failure, he wrote. A sad but unremarkable fate. What no one realized, not the grieving sister beside the coffin, not the priest reading soft prayers, not even Pierce as he pulled the exposure lever, was that someone in that very photograph had killed her. Soft pause, wind sounds. A camera is an unfeeling witness. It does not blink, it does not forget. It remembers what the living choose to overlook. The photograph shows more than 24 mourners, their faces set in expressions of grief, or at least, the performance of it. Women in long black veils, men with stiff hats pressed against their chests. A small child clutching a woolen scarf. But one figure stands out to modern eyes. A man in a black overcoat, positioned half a step behind the others. He is turned ever so slightly away from the coffin, his shoulders tense, his gloved hands clasped tightly together. At first glance, nothing about him seems remarkable. Yet in that stiffness, in that fixed stare, lies a story of guilt. Narration deepens. For 119 years, the photograph sat quietly in a cedar box inside a historical archive. Generations passed. The faces faded. Names were forgotten. But when it was digitized in 2023 as part of a preservation project, new eyes, trained not just in history, but in forensics, looked at it. High-resolution scans revealed tiny, deliberate alterations around the man's face. Someone, long ago, had attempted to soften his features, to blur his presence just enough to make him blend in. It was the kind of crude retouching common in the early 20th century, but here, it wasn't done to beautify a family portrait. It was done to make a murderer invisible. Tension builds slowly. When the forensic team enhanced the shadows and compared the blurred figure to known portraits from the period, a name emerged: Thomas Everett. In 1904, Everett was considered a model gentleman, a respected financial advisor, a member of several social clubs, and a distant cousin of Clara Whitfield. To the outside world, he was a grieving relative. To history, he would become something else entirely. Pause, soft music under voice. What makes this photograph extraordinary isn't just that the killer was present. Many murderers return to the scene of their crimes, often unable to resist watching the aftermath they've orchestrated. What makes it chilling is how close he stood. Just a few feet from the coffin. Just a breath away from the family whose lives he had upended. Hidden in plain sight. Photographs from this era were meant to memorialize the dead, to preserve a final image for families to hold on to. But sometimes, unintentionally, they also preserved the truth. A truth too quiet to be heard then, but too permanent to be erased later. Beat. In the snow that morning, no one noticed the man's clenched jaw. No one asked why his eyes weren't lowered like the others. And no one could have guessed that this single frozen moment would, more than a century later, reopen a murder investigation thought to be impossible. Narrator, whisper, final line of chapter. The camera saw everything. And in the end, that was enough. Narrator, steady, reflective tone. Before the tragedy of January 1904, Clara Whitfield had been something rare in her time. A woman of means, education, and independence in a world built to deny her all three. She had inherited a modest bookshop at the age of 19 after the death of her parents. Most in Portsmouth expected she would sell it quickly, marry, and disappear into domesticity. Instead, she did something unthinkable for the era. She expanded it. She traveled to Boston alone, met with publishers, negotiated contracts, and imported rare editions that attracted intellectuals from surrounding towns. Within a decade, the Whitfield Book Room was not only a thriving business but also a quiet hub for teachers, students, and local thinkers. Clara became known not just as a shopkeeper, but as a mind of her own. Her intelligence and ambition, however, made her a subject of whispered conversations. Portsmouth was in those days a conservative coastal town, a place where women were expected to host tea, not manage investments. When Clara purchased shares in a shipping company and, later, in an early electrical manufacturer, some called her daring. Others called her reckless. But the truth was simple. Clara Whitfield understood numbers. She read the financial pages every morning. She kept meticulous ledgers. She knew the value of independence. Soft music, tone deepens. And with independence came attention. Men approached her with flattering smiles and marriage proposals wrapped in polite language. She declined them all. A woman alone with money in 1904 was considered vulnerable, no matter how intelligent she was. Her fortune, quietly accumulated, made her both admired and envied. By the winter of 1903, Clara's assets were substantial for the time. She owned her bookshop outright, had multiple investment accounts in Boston, and a considerable trust inherited from her parents. It wasn't a fortune that could move nations, but in a town of fishermen, tradesmen, and clerks, it made her a figure of quiet power. She was not just another woman in black silk dresses. She was the woman who signed her own contracts. Pause, low wind sound. But there was something else, something few knew. For months leading up to her death, Clara had grown uneasy. The precise, careful woman who double-checked every ledger began to notice discrepancies. Small ones at first, odd withdrawals, a misaligned figure in the books, a letter from a Boston bank that didn't match her personal records. She mentioned it only to her housekeeper in passing, late one December night. "Someone's playing with shadows in my accounts," she'd said. And shadows always have hands behind them. A week later, Clara visited her lawyer to request an audit of her finances. That lawyer, an unassuming man named Robert Halbridge, prepared legal documents to begin an inquiry. But those papers were never signed. They were found after her death, still neatly stacked in her desk drawer. Music darkens. Clara was cautious, yes. But she trusted family. And among the few people with access to her accounts was her distant cousin, Thomas Everett. He had charmed her with polite manners and financial expertise, presenting himself as the perfect gentleman in a world that revered such appearances. To Clara, he was family, someone she had known since childhood summers spent on the coast. What she didn't know was that Everett had been quietly draining her fortune for years, a small percentage at a time, carefully hidden behind forged records and fictitious investment portfolios. Narration lowers to a whisper. This made Clara more than just a victim. It made her a threat. A living woman who had finally begun to see the hand behind the shadows. The last letter Clara attempted to write, found crumpled but legible in a waste bin, was addressed to Halbridge. In it she wrote, "I believe something is wrong. Someone is taking what is mine. I cannot ignore it any longer." Those words were never sent. The ink was still wet when the housekeeper found her body. Subtle piano underscore. What makes this story cruel is that Clara wasn't careless. She was careful. She wasn't naive. She was intelligent. She saw the danger forming at the edges of her quiet, controlled life, but she underestimated how far someone close to her would go to silence her. In a society where a woman's voice was often dismissed, Clara's financial independence made her powerful, but also isolated. When the doctor wrote "heart failure" on the certificate, no one questioned it. No one believed a woman like Clara could be the victim of foul play. To them, she was just another woman gone too soon. To Everett, she was a problem erased. Narrator, final line, soft, chilling. But the truth would not stay buried. Her ledger told a story. Her unfinished letter whispered her fear. And though she didn't know it, her funeral photograph would hold the final piece. Narrator, low, steady tone. On the morning of January 17, 1904, the world outside Clara Whitfield's house was white with frost. The bay at Portsmouth lay frozen at its edges, and the sky carried that particular pale gray of a New England winter morning, heavy, silent, and cold. Inside the Whitfield home on Water Street, the fire in the hearth had burned down to soft embers. The housekeeper, Mary Leland, rose just after dawn as she always did, to prepare tea and warm water for Clara's morning routine. She moved through the house expecting the same quiet order as every day before. But as she passed the second-floor landing, she noticed something strange. Clara's bedroom door, which was usually left slightly ajar, was closed tight. More than that, there was an unusual stillness behind it. Clara was a light sleeper, often awake before the fire was stoked. But that morning, there was no sound, no creak of floorboards, no movement of papers, no voice calling down for tea. Only silence. Mary hesitated, hand on the doorknob, before softly knocking. No reply. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. When she finally opened the door, a faint and acrid odor met her nose, bitter and sharp, like something metallic hanging in the air. Music lowers into a tense hum. The curtains were drawn. The room was cold. Clara lay on her bed, still in her nightdress, one arm bent stiffly against her chest, the other twisted awkwardly toward the edge of the mattress. Her eyes were open, wide and glassy, staring at nothing. The housekeeper dropped the water jug she was carrying. The sound shattered the morning silence, but Clara did not stir. Pause. Later, Mary would tell investigators that what struck her most wasn't just Clara's stillness, but the look on her face. A frozen grimace, jaw locked, lips drawn back slightly, as if caught mid-breath. At the time, such details were dismissed as the natural posture of the dead. But to a modern forensic eye, it is an unmistakable sign of violent muscular contractions, a hallmark of strychnine poisoning. In 1904, strychnine was widely available in the United States, sold over the counter as a pesticide for rats and other pests. It was potent, cheap, and in small doses, easily concealed. Poisoning deaths, though not unheard of, often passed uninvestigated, especially when the victim was a woman and the apparent cause could be written off as a weak heart. Narration slows, detailed tone. The doctor who arrived at the Whitfield home that morning, Dr. James Harrow, spent no more than 20 minutes in the bedroom. He did not conduct an autopsy. He did not take samples. Instead, he inspected the body briefly, glanced at the nightstand, and declared, "Cardiac failure brought on by exhaustion." He signed the certificate and left. In 1904, such a decision carried the weight of finality. There were no forensic pathologists in small towns. No toxicology tests. Once a death was labeled natural, it was rarely questioned. Soft piano enters. But there were clues. They were simply invisible to the eyes of the time. The bitter smell in the room, likely the residue of the poison itself. The stiffness of her limbs. The partially spilled glass of water on her nightstand, still tinged with a faint white powder. The small scratches on the inside of her palm where she had clawed at the bedsheet in her final seconds. Mary Leland, shaken and trembling, was instructed to prepare the body for burial. In Victorian and Edwardian customs, families often handled death privately. Clara's body was washed, dressed in a simple black gown, and placed in the parlor within hours. The speed of it all was not suspicious then. It was simply tradition. Tone hardens. But behind the quiet morning rituals, the truth was far from peaceful. Strychnine acts quickly. Within minutes of ingestion, the victim experiences tightening muscles, convulsions, and an overwhelming sensation of suffocation. Consciousness remains intact. The victim feels everything. And because the poison affects the nervous system rather than stopping the heart directly, the resulting death can be misread, as it was in Clara's case. Brief silence, then a quiet whisper. She had not died in her sleep. She had died awake, in pain and alone. Outside, the town began to murmur. A woman of 31, healthy and bright, struck down without warning. Some whispered of overwork. Others said she must have ignored a heart condition. Few suspected foul play. And among those few who might have guessed, none spoke it aloud. Death was treated with reverence, not inquiry. Thomas Everett, when notified of his cousin's passing, sent a telegram expressing his condolences. He did not rush to the house that morning. He did not offer comfort to the family. He calmly informed them he would return from Boston in time for the funeral. Narrator, soft, measured. In the span of a single morning, a careful woman was transformed into a silent figure in a black coffin. Her questions died with her, and her fortune, though not yet spoken of, now hung in quiet suspension. And just as her killer intended, the town accepted the doctor's words as truth. No questions. No investigation. No justice. Final whisper. But death leaves traces, even when no one is looking. Narrator, low, deliberate tone. When news of Clara Whitfield's sudden death reached Thomas Everett in Boston, the telegram reached him at precisely 11:42 a.m. He was seated in the smoking room of the Union Club of Boston, a private gentleman's establishment where businessmen and politicians mingled beneath high ceilings and chandeliers. Everett read the telegram twice, folded it neatly, and placed it inside his coat pocket. Witnesses described no visible sign of shock on his face. Only a slight tightening around the mouth, the sort that could easily be mistaken for solemn composure. But in truth, for Thomas Everett, this was not a tragedy. It was the execution of a plan. To understand the murderer, one must understand the man. Thomas Everett was the son of a modest shipping clerk and had spent much of his youth watching the old New England families live lives he could never touch. He learned early that money was power, and that appearances could open doors even when wealth could not. Everett cultivated charm like a weapon. He spoke softly, dressed immaculately, and always knew just enough about the right subjects to make influential men listen. It was this cultivated poise that eventually gained him Clara's trust. He had reconnected with Clara some years earlier, when she inherited her parents' estate. They were cousins, yes, but only distantly so, close enough to be familiar, far enough to keep secrets. He offered to help her manage her growing financial interests. In 1898, when women could not easily access investment channels without male intermediaries, his offer seemed practical, even protective. Clara, pragmatic but not yet suspicious, accepted. And from that moment on, Everett's hand was in everything. Soft, dark piano. He began slowly. A small withdrawal here, an invented fee there. He forged correspondence from a Boston bank, redirecting dividends into accounts only he could access. He created fake stock certificates that matched real company letterheads and kept them in her personal safe, so that even if Clara checked her papers, everything appeared legitimate. His theft was elegant because it was quiet. It lived in ledgers, in ink, in paper that no one else read as carefully as he did. By 1903, Everett had siphoned what today would amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Clara's growing attention to her accounts was narrowing the walls around him. The irregularities she noticed were no accident. They were cracks in his carefully constructed illusion. She had already spoken with her lawyer. She was planning an audit. For Everett, this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. Narrator, voice sharpens. Financial crimes in the early 1900s were often buried quietly, especially when they involved family. But Clara was not a woman inclined to silence. If she uncovered the theft, Everett faced public humiliation, possible imprisonment, and, perhaps worse in his eyes, permanent exile from the circles of influence he'd worked his whole life to enter. And so Everett did what men of his particular nature often do when threatened. He removed the obstacle. Music lowers to a hum, cold tone. Records later uncovered show Everett purchased a small quantity of strychnine under a false name at a chemist's shop in Boston just days before Clara's death. It was registered as rat poison, common enough to raise no questions. He returned to Portsmouth quietly on the 14th of January. There are no records of any visit to Clara's home in those days, but a neighbor would later recall a well-dressed man leaving the house by the back gate late at night. Everett knew Clara's routines. She drank water before bed. She kept her glass by the nightstand. And she trusted her cousin. He was methodical. He slipped the poison into her water late on the night of the 16th. He made sure no one saw him. He left before dawn. By the time Mary Leland discovered the body, Everett was already back in Boston, sending polite condolences by telegram. A man far from the crime scene. Or so it seemed. Pause, soft wind sound. When he returned to Portsmouth 2 days later, dressed in a black wool coat and a carefully measured expression of grief, the town received him as the image of a mourning relative. He spoke softly. He comforted Clara's sister. He met with the lawyer. And, most importantly, he oversaw the transfer of Clara's accounts. The death certificate said heart failure. There was no autopsy. No one objected when the accounts passed temporarily to Everett's management, pending estate decisions. He had written his escape into the very structure of the law. Narrator, quietly. Perhaps the most chilling part of this story is not the moment of the crime, but the precision with which it was folded into everyday life. Everett didn't need to hide the body. He only needed to let the world look away. Tension builds slowly. In the end, Everett stood to inherit nothing outright. But as executor of her estate, and with forged documents hidden in bank archives, he gained access to everything he had stolen, with the blessing of the town itself. The thief did not break in. He walked through the front door. Narrator, final line, lo. And 3 days later he would return once more. Not to confess. Not to repent. But to stand quietly at her funeral, just out of reach of the coffin. Narrator, low, deliberate tone. Clara Whitfield's funeral took place on January 20, 1904, under a pale winter sun that seemed to shiver over the frozen streets of Portsmouth. The gathering was small but respectable, attended by her closest relatives, family friends, and a few town officials. Among them, Thomas Everett moved with careful composure, appearing as a grieving cousin, the very image of propriety and sorrow. To the townspeople he was merely a witness to tragedy. To him, it was a stage upon which he could survey the landscape of suspicion, unseen but vigilant. Yet, even as the mourners spoke in hushed tones and the minister intoned the customary prayers, there were those who noticed irregularities. Mary Leland, still shaken by what she had seen in Clara's bedroom, remembered Everett's strange attentiveness to the coffin and the careful positioning of financial papers around the estate. Small, almost imperceptible actions that, at the time, seemed merely odd. But hindsight has a way of revealing intent. The investigation into Clara's death did not begin immediately. At the time, sudden deaths were common, and medical oversight in small towns was limited. Dr. James Harrow, who had signed the certificate, was respected and known for his prompt but superficial evaluations. It was only when a former Boston police officer, Richard Fleming, was contacted by Clara's sister, Elizabeth Whitfield, that a true examination of the circumstances began. Fleming had retired from active duty but maintained a keen interest in cases of financial fraud and unexplained deaths, particularly when women of independent means were involved. His reputation for meticulousness and discretion made him the ideal investigator. On January 21st, he arrived in Portsmouth with his notebooks, magnifying glass, and a set of scales calibrated for delicate measurements, the tools of a man who understood that small details often held the keys to monumental discoveries. Music darkens, slow strings. Fleming began with Clara's personal documents. Her ledgers, letters, and investment papers had all been left in her desk, a modest oak piece with multiple locked compartments. What struck him immediately was not the disorder, for the desk was well kept, but the anomalies in the numbers themselves. Payments that had no record of receipt, stock certificates from companies that did not exist, and correspondences allegedly from Boston banks that bore inconsistent seals. These were signs of deliberate manipulation, and the patterns were too systematic to be accidental. The handwriting on some documents, upon closer inspection, matched Everett's known script. He had tried to disguise it, but small flourishes betrayed him. Fleming's next step was to interview household staff and neighbors. Mary Leland recounted the bitter odor in Clara's room, the stiffness of her limbs, and the unnatural expression on her face, details that, when combined with the financial irregularities, painted a disturbing picture. Neighbors mentioned seeing Everett near the house at odd hours, though he had claimed to be in Boston at the time. Each account, each small observation, began to converge into a troubling narrative. The most revealing discovery came when Fleming analyzed Clara's glass of water. Though long discarded, he had acquired a small sample from the household for chemical analysis using rudimentary reagents of the time. Tests indicated the presence of strychnine, a fact that, when paired with the patterns in the financial documents, suggested a chilling conclusion. Clara had been murdered, and her death was not accidental. Pause, soft ominous hum. It was clear to Fleming that the murderer was someone with both knowledge of her routines and access to her life. Everett's close relationship, combined with his financial role, positioned him as the only logical suspect. But connecting the dots required patience, as the man he was investigating was calculated, meticulous, and socially adept. Everett had cultivated respectability in Boston. He was a man who could influence the perception of truth simply through his presence. Fleming's method was systematic. He cross-referenced ledgers with actual company records in Boston, verified signatures with local registries, and traced bank accounts through multiple intermediaries. He also maintained a discreet presence in Portsmouth, attending public events, observing Everett's interactions, and noting his reactions to any questions regarding Clara's finances. Every gesture, every word, became data to be analyzed. Even Everett's carefully practiced expressions of grief betrayed subtle tension when Fleming's gaze lingered too long. By February, Fleming had compiled a comprehensive file that mapped Everett's duplicity in meticulous detail, falsified investments, forged documents, misappropriated funds, and access to a lethal poison. What he did not yet have was a confession or incontrovertible proof linking Everett directly to Clara's death, the piece that would transform suspicion into actionable evidence. But Fleming knew that timing and observation could force mistakes. Everett, confident in his facade, would eventually slip. And when he did, every detail, every ledger's discrepancy, every false signature, every minute deviation in his routine would be documented, ready to expose him for the criminal he truly was. Narrator, soft, concluding tone. Thus began the delicate dance between detective and killer. A battle not waged with gunfire or confrontation, but through observation, deduction, and patience. The townspeople saw only a grieving cousin and a quiet investigator, yet beneath the surface, a deadly calculus unfolded. One misstep, one oversight, and the truth of Clara Whitfield's murder would finally be revealed. The stage was set, and both men knew that the next move could determine everything. Narrator, low, deliberate tone. By early March 1904, Richard Fleming's investigation had reached a critical juncture. He had traced forged documents, verified fraudulent accounts, and identified Thomas Everett as the only plausible perpetrator of Clara Whitfield's murder. Yet despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Everett remained untouchable in the eyes of the law. The local authorities were hesitant, reluctant to challenge a man of Everett's standing, and the town of Portsmouth clung to appearances of propriety. Fleming realized that a direct confrontation was necessary, a measured approach that would force Everett into revealing cracks in his carefully constructed facade. On the morning of March 12, Fleming requested a private meeting with Everett at the latter's rented suite in Boston. The suite was modest but elegantly furnished, a reflection of Everett's cultivated tastes and desire to appear respectable. Fleming arrived early, carrying a leather-bound portfolio containing the results of his meticulous research, bank ledgers, correspondence, stock certificates, and handwritten annotations highlighting anomalies. He waited in the sitting room, examining Everett's choices in furniture, noting how the arrangement created a natural vantage point to observe anyone who entered, a subtle indication of the man's tendency to control environments, a characteristic that often accompanies methodical criminals. When Everett entered, he was composed, impeccably dressed in a dark wool coat and vest, gloves folded neatly in his hand. Fleming greeted him politely, masking any sense of urgency, and offered a seat. Everett's expression remained carefully neutral, but Fleming detected a subtle tension in the hands, a faint twitch of the fingers, the first sign of agitation. This was not a man accustomed to being scrutinized. Music swells, strings tense. Fleming began the meeting with civility, discussing general financial matters, investment strategies, and local Boston banking procedures. Everett spoke confidently, offering explanations for minor discrepancies, all while maintaining an air of calm authority. Then, slowly, Fleming laid out the anomalies, document by document, ledger by ledger. He presented copies of stock certificates from companies that did not exist, letters from fictitious bank clerks, and withdrawals traced to accounts under false names. Each piece was accompanied by his observations, cross-referenced with third-party records from banks and rail companies. Everett's first reaction was subtle, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a pause in speech, but he continued to maintain his posture. Every gesture, every carefully measured word, was calculated to appear normal. Fleming's most effective tactic was not accusation but implication. He did not say, "You killed Clara Whitfield." Instead, he asked questions designed to force Everett to respond in ways that would betray knowledge of details only the killer could know. He inquired about minor discrepancies in timing, the presence of certain ledger entries, and the authenticity of seals on correspondence. Everett deflected, feigned ignorance, or offered explanations that were technically possible but logically improbable. Yet with each response, Fleming observed subtle micro-expressions, a fleeting tightening of the jaw, the quick blink, the slightly raised eyebrow. In behavioral psychology, these are classic signs of stress under deception, indicators that the person has something to conceal. By the hour's end, Everett began to sense the danger. Fleming's calm, systematic approach left no room for improvisation. The web of evidence was tight, yet Fleming had not accused, he had merely let the facts speak. Everett understood that any aggressive response could further incriminate him. Instead, he attempted to reassert control, diverting the conversation to neutral topics, yet he could not erase the pattern. His finances, his access, his knowledge of the poison, all aligned in a way that only a guilty man could orchestrate. Music drops to a chilling whisper. Fleming left the suite with no admission, but with something perhaps more valuable. The certainty that Everett was aware of the investigator's knowledge and that his calculated composure could falter. The detective's strategy now shifted. Observation and timing would be essential. Everett's subsequent actions would provide the next pieces of the puzzle. In the days following the confrontation, Fleming monitored Everett discreetly. He noted changes in routine, trips that seemed unnecessarily hurried, additional correspondence with Boston banks, and unusually frequent visits to chemists and apothecaries. Each movement suggested not innocence, but preparation, the calculated adjustments of a man who felt the walls closing in. Fleming also secured duplicates of all key documents, hidden in multiple locations to prevent destruction. He coordinated with trusted colleagues in Boston to ensure that if Everett attempted to flee or manipulate evidence, the network of verification would remain intact. It was a race of intellect against intellect, patience against cunning. Everett's sophistication was formidable, but so too was Fleming's meticulousness. Narrator, final line, low, suspenseful. And so the confrontation ended without confession, but with inevitability. Everett had glimpsed the reach of Fleming's investigation, and Fleming had glimpsed the depth of Everett's duplicity. The stage was set for the final act. The exposure of fraud, the revelation of murder, and the unraveling of a man who had hidden in plain sight. Narrator, low, deliberate tone. After the tense confrontation in Boston, Richard Fleming returned to Portsmouth with a renewed determination. Everett's carefully constructed facade was still intact, but cracks had begun to appear, subtle yet unmistakable. Fleming understood that a criminal as meticulous as Everett would never slip through overt error. The victory would come from persistence, from patient accumulation of evidence until the killer could no longer maintain control. Over the next several weeks, Fleming embarked on a methodical campaign to cross-reference every detail of Clara Whitfield's life, finances, and final days. His approach was painstaking, a blend of forensic inquiry, financial analysis, and human observation. No ledger was left unchecked, no letter unexamined, no witness unspoken to. Fleming first revisited the bank accounts linked to Everett, analyzing deposits, withdrawals, and transfers. Some accounts were straightforward, tied to legitimate businesses, but others were labyrinthine, accounts under pseudonyms, transferred through multiple banks, and linked to phantom investments in shipping companies, railroads, and real estate ventures that existed only on paper. Each transaction, when followed carefully, revealed a pattern. Everett was siphoning funds in small, almost imperceptible amounts, creating the illusion of steady returns while diverting wealth for personal use. Fleming compared these records with Clara's personal documents and letters, noting inconsistencies, promised dividends that never arrived, receipts that bore forged signatures, and bank confirmations that were falsified with astonishing precision. Yet financial fraud alone was not sufficient to convict Everett of murder. Fleming turned next to Clara's final days, reconstructing a timeline with the precision of a surgeon. He examined her personal diaries, household accounts, and statements from staff and neighbors. Margaret Leland, the maid, provided crucial insight. Clara had mentioned a persistent bitter taste on her tongue for days, complained of muscle cramps, and exhibited intermittent tremors, symptoms that contemporary doctors could have mistaken for ordinary illness but, in retrospect, aligned perfectly with strychnine poisoning. Music intensifies, strings tense. Fleming then combined the behavioral with the physical. He mapped Everett's movements through Portsmouth and Boston, identifying the times he visited Clara under the guise of financial consultation. Cross-referencing this with chemical records and the availability of poisons in the region, he established that Everett had the opportunity, knowledge, and motive to administer a lethal substance. Here, the genius of Everett's method met its vulnerability, subtlety. His reliance on small doses to mask the cause of death created patterns, repeated visits, consistent timing that could, with careful observation, be traced back to him. The next breakthrough came from communication networks. Fleming uncovered letters and telegrams, some misfiled or intentionally delayed, that revealed Everett's duplicity. One letter, postmarked January 15th, instructed an associate in Boston to acquire chemicals and to prepare falsified documents for the Whitfield estate, using the pretext of legitimate business. Another, from February, detailed manipulations of stock certificates, indicating that Everett anticipated scrutiny and had begun preparing an elaborate paper trail to obscure his thefts. The evidence painted a damning portrait. Everett had planned the financial fraud meticulously and executed the murder with equal precision. His confidence, born of past success and social standing, had blinded him to the meticulousness of a determined investigator. Fleming's final stroke was to synthesize the physical, financial, and behavioral evidence into a coherent timeline. Every visit Everett made, every letter he sent, and every ledger entry was catalogued. Fleming employed rudimentary forensic charts, plotting times, locations, and chemical availability, demonstrating that only Everett could have orchestrated both the theft and Clara's poisoning. This multidimensional approach, combining timelines, behavioral observation, and financial verification, was revolutionary for its time. It turned circumstantial evidence into an interlocking web, leaving Everett with fewer and fewer plausible defenses. Pause, ominous undertone. Fleming did not confront Everett directly after compiling this new evidence. Instead, he disseminated copies of his findings to trusted legal advisors and local authorities, ensuring redundancy. The pressure began to mount. Everett, now aware that Fleming's scrutiny could not be evaded, became increasingly restless. Uncharacteristic mistakes emerged, hurried correspondence, misdated documents, and subtle inconsistencies in his explanations of financial matters. These cracks, invisible to the casual observer, were unmistakable to Fleming. The killer's confidence, once impenetrable, was beginning to falter. Each error, however minor, reinforced the investigator's case. The web Everett had spun was unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of systematic observation. Narrator, final line, slow, suspenseful. By late March, the stage was nearly set for confrontation, not of words, but of undeniable proof. Fleming had transformed suspicion into near certainty. Everett, whose intellect and cunning had allowed him to evade justice for so long, now faced the relentless logic of evidence that could not be ignored. Every forged document, every falsified ledger, every subtle act of deception was catalogued, leaving him no room for maneuver. The web he had woven to conceal murder and betrayal was collapsing, and the moment of reckoning drew inexorably closer. Narrator, slow, deliberate tone. By early April 1904, all the pieces were in place. Richard Fleming had assembled an unassailable dossier: forged documents, falsified financial records, letters revealing deliberate manipulation, and a timeline proving that Thomas Everett had both the opportunity and the knowledge to murder Clara Whitfield. The web of deceit Everett had woven over 3 years, his financial duplicity, his careful cultivation of trust, and his audacious confidence that no one would uncover the truth, was now fully exposed. Yet even with overwhelming evidence, the final step remained the most critical: ensuring that the authorities would act, that justice would be served, and that Everett could no longer hide behind social prestige and wealth. Fleming knew that he faced the same challenge that investigators before him had encountered. Influential figures often shielded criminals from prosecution, especially when their crimes were concealed behind layers of complexity. Fleming's strategy was meticulous. He contacted the Portsmouth authorities with a detailed memorandum, providing copies of all primary documents, cross-referenced ledgers, witness statements, and chemical records indicating poisoning. The memorandum outlined Everett's fraudulent financial schemes, the manipulation of Clara Whitfield's personal wealth, and his likely method of administering the poison. Fleming anticipated that local authorities, hesitant and inexperienced with such layered crimes, might attempt to dismiss or downplay the evidence. To counter this, he enlisted the expertise of Boston detectives with prior experience in complex financial fraud and homicide investigations. These detectives independently verified the evidence, confirming the existence of multiple fictitious accounts, forged letters, and transactions tied to Everett. They corroborated Fleming's findings regarding the timeline of Clara's poisoning, the accessibility of strychnine, and Everett's repeated opportunities to administer the fatal doses. Music swells, ominous. The resulting report left no room for doubt. Everett's financial manipulations had been carefully orchestrated to appear legitimate while systematically draining Clara Whitfield's wealth. His access to her home and knowledge of chemistry, coupled with the physical symptoms Clara exhibited before her death, pointed unmistakably to premeditated strychnine poisoning. The pattern was clear: calculated, deliberate, and concealed behind layers of social propriety. Fleming, however, did not rely solely on paper evidence. He understood that criminals like Everett often attempted to discredit investigators through intimidation, misdirection, or manipulation of social networks. Therefore, he arranged for multiple independent verifications of key evidence, ensuring that any attempt by Everett to refute the claims would fail. Witnesses were discreetly re-interviewed, and duplicates of all ledgers and letters were stored in secure locations in Boston and Portsmouth. With the dossier complete, the authorities issued an arrest warrant. Everett, perhaps anticipating the inevitability of legal action, attempted a final gambit. He fled Boston under a false identity, leaving only a trail of partially falsified correspondence and hastily abandoned documents. Yet his flight, instead of indicating innocence, confirmed guilt. He had meticulously planned his escape, maintaining multiple identities and secret accounts, but the very precision required to manage these duplicities left traces that Fleming and the authorities could follow. Music softens, reflective tone. In the months that followed, Everett was traced to New England cities, then to the southern United States, and finally to South America, where he appeared to assume yet another identity as a financial consultant to expatriates. Each lead confirmed the scope of his duplicity: a life built on lies, theft, and murder, now unraveling piece by piece. Fleming continued his correspondence with international authorities, ensuring that Everett's movements were documented and that any opportunity for justice, however delayed, remained possible. The Whitfield estate, finally reconciled after years of uncertainty, became a testament to the meticulousness of both the criminal and the investigator. Clara's legacy, once nearly erased by Everett's greed and ruthlessness, was restored through diligent examination of her life and finances. Fleming's work demonstrated that even the most carefully executed crimes leave traces, patterns, and vulnerabilities that, with patience and skill, can be uncovered. Narrator, final line, low, resolute. The funeral photograph of Clara Whitfield, preserved for over a decade, became symbolic, not merely a record of grief, but a silent witness to Everett's audacity and ultimate downfall. For over a century, it held secrets that modern forensic insight and meticulous detective work could finally reveal. Everett's deception, his poisoning, and his theft were laid bare, proving that even those who hide in plain sight cannot escape the relentless logic of evidence. And Richard Fleming, patient and precise, ensured that history would remember the truth.